So I'm Dr. Sarah Monks. I teach art history at the University of East Anglia in Norwich in the UK. And I work on 18th and 19th century art, mostly British, but actually recently I've started looking at some American art. And yeah, I'm going to talk today about Washington Allston's painting, wonderful little cabinet picture called Lorenzo and Jessica from 1832. And it was much smaller actually than I had certainly suspected. Seeing it in reproduction, I'd assumed it was a larger picture because it's a history painting, a kind of genre of art that one usually would associate with larger pictures. But actually what we've got here is what's called a cabinet picture. It's a type of painting that is meant to be consumed really within a home, obviously quite a wealthy home, but nevertheless somebody's domestic interior. Allston is an interesting figure. Okay, he's born right in the middle of the American War of Independence. Okay, another figure who is, is in some ways shaped, I think, by that history. He's the son of very wealthy, kind of prosperous plantations, i.e. slave owners in South Carolina. And it's the money that he, inherits, as it were, through his family that allows him really to pursue the artistic career and indeed the kind of art making that he does. He goes to Harvard, as, kind of wealthy young men were meant to do, at least. And he's kind of quickly develops this reputation for sophistication. Okay, his nickname is the Count because he dresses so finely. And something about his air, his manners, his I suspect his kind of intellectual state of being and poetic state of being in the world already at that kind of young age. Was striking to his contemporaries. But he had clearly, through his childhood, started to develop, as an artist. And when he graduated from Harvard, he went straight to London and to work with the American artists that young men of his generation wanted to study with, Benjamin West. The American painter who had crossed the Atlantic, the first American painter to do so in 1760, and had established really a kind of landmark studio in the history of art, actually, I have to say, in which was kind of renowned for its openness. For the fact that you could go there and you could really learn. But West was famously very open about how to paint and teaching his students how to do that. And I think we see the results of that in Allston's relationship with his work and indeed the painting that we're looking at. It's the product of an artist who has really thought about painting and really has looked and learnt about the history of painting in Europe. In particular, it's Venetian painting, that very kind of layered, suffused, soft kind of glazes that are layered and layered on top of each other that produce that, kind of rich, deep, smoky kind of effect that we see in this picture. So Allston also tried his hand at poetry, and thinking about his paintings as poems is, the result is what we see here with Lorenzo and Jessica. It depicts an unusual moment in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, a play which we would more usually think of as being, about conflict, about betrayal, about judgment. Instead, it's interesting that Allston focuses on this exceptional moment within Shakespeare's play. At the beginning of Act 5, the final act of the play, which is kind of a little interlude, we've just had in the fourth act this very dramatic courtroom scene. And Shakespeare, at the beginning of the next act, takes us straight out into the countryside, to the gardens at a villa where we meet again with this couple whose deep romance has been one of the themes in the play, Lorenzo and Jessica, the daughter of the Jewish moneylender Shylock. Lorenzo and Jessica have eloped. She is Jewish and he is a Gentile, and have escaped her father, and find themselves almost kind of in exile at this country villa. Lorenzo asks for musicians to start playing music. And at that point, there's this kind of long speech, monologue from Lorenzo, in which he reflects, he suddenly becomes a poet. How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank, those words inscribed on the reverse of Allston's painting. Here will we sit and let the sounds of music creep in our ears. Soft stillness and the night become the touches of sweet harmony. Sit, Jessica. Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold, patines like discs of bright gold. So yeah, it's very poetic, heavy with visual kinds of language, but also interesting that there's a sort of what we call a synesthesia. There's a kind of crossing over of the senses, thinking about letting the sounds of music touch us. The sweet harmony of the sight of night. So that idea of seeing a music as being almost kind of similar things. Okay, so he really starts to, kind of direct her attention to the senses, to aesthetic experience. Jessica's response is clearly resisting. She's very active. Her pose is quite directed. Her hands are kind of pointing and gesturing quite, strongly. Lorenzo, by contrast, kind of leans back as if in repose. And in the middle of the picture, looks as though Lorenzo's hand is staying Jessica's, is saying, no, sit, Jessica, which is actually what he says in the middle of the monologue, okay, sit. Calm yourself and look. It's an extraordinary kind of moment of peace and reflection in Shakespeare's play. And it's interesting that we see him right in the centre of Allston's painting. The focus is not on Jessica, the prize, as it were. It's on Lorenzo. And his words are inscribed on the reverse of Allston's painting. I think it's interesting that Allston chose this scene from the play. Any other artist, I suspect, we know, would have chosen perhaps moments involving the drama around Shylock, and the kind of deal that he cuts and the way in which he is tricked by the other characters. But instead we get this scene with Lorenzo at the centre, the poet. Allston's emphasis upon poetry, the aesthetic experience, is here, I think, to see. And the shape, unusual kind of composition where we move from the left-hand side with the kind of rigour of the architecture, we see it in great detail, over and down in this kind of diagonal line to the distant profile of the city at night. The architecture of the city has become just forms against which we see this glowing sky, which is painted, in an amazing way by Allston with this very kind of tactile, material quality. We really get the sense of it as painting. And I think so Allston's kind of commitment to art making and aesthetic experience and poetic experience are here to see. What we know from Allston's thoughts about art is that he was a very strong believer in private experience of art. Okay, so the size of this work is related to that. We're drawn into it, by its size. We're made to come closer to it and to experience it, kind of intimately. Size is also perhaps significant because of Allston's situation at this point. What we know of his career is that he struggled financially, after he'd, spent, I guess, his inheritance on, having this initial experience, developing training as an artist in Europe. He was crowdfunded to help Allston keep working as an artist without having to worry about money, so i.e., the purity to some extent of intention and of aesthetic kind of commitments, artistic practice that we see going on in this work, that idea that they might be corrupted or somehow diluted by having to work for money. So he's saved from that kind of situation by these, but only just by these patrons. Just a few years before this picture was painted, we know he had to move to a smaller studio. So he kind of scales down, even though we know he's also desperately trying to finish these large canvases that he's been working on for years. There's something here, I think, about cherishing and needing, as it were, the smaller scale of a painting like this. It's got a kind of gem-like quality to it in that way, that's related to the subject matter, but also, I think, to Allston's circumstances.